freedom of choice, multiple endings, butterfly effect. Your choices matter and will impact the story and characters. These are some buzzwords that you and a lot of people probably associate with the 2015 interactive horror game Until Dawn, developed by Supermassive Games. When the game was first released, it was critically well received. Until Dawn was praised for not only subverting the tropes of old 80s slasher movies like Friday the 13th, but it's also famous for its butterfly effect system. When writing about this complex system, various game critics mentioned in their reviews that the choices that they made felt weighty and consequential, because whatever decision they made would significantly impact both the game and the character's fates. For example, Alexa Ray Correa from GameSpot liked the game for its impactful choices and the quote-unquote paranoia it invokes during critical choices that risk the lives of certain characters. Now, while I'm not going to invalidate or argue with any critic's experiences with Until Dawn, as I think those are just completely subjective experiences, I want to focus on what seems to be a huge aspect that both critics and players praise when discussing this game, the quote-unquote freedom of choice, the idea that your decisions significantly affect the game's narrative. The reason why I want to emphasize on these points about free will and choice are because I don't personally believe that they even exist in the game, or at the very least are grossly exaggerated. While Until Dawn may give the illusion of choice by allowing you to choose between two options of dialogue, and it may give you the illusion of free will by letting you decide how many of the characters live or die, whether it's all or none or some, in the end that's all that it really is, an illusion. You see, prior to the game's release, the marketing heavily emphasized on how, quote, every decision and every single action affects your fate. And sure, there are certainly some moments where this is apparent. For example, in Chapter 6, the Psycho puts Chris in a position in which he either has to shoot Ashley, himself, or do nothing, and whatever decision you decide ultimately determines whether Chris lives or dies in Chapter 8. Unfortunately, moments like these are very much exceptions instead of the norm, because in actuality, the game is a lot more restrictive than it appears based on what you can or can't do. The game tricks you into thinking that you have control over the game's narrative, and the fates of the characters through methods such as, giving multiple dialogue options or pressuring the player in successfully completing the QuickTime events. This is especially true during some of the more horror and action-based sequences, because in these moments, you don't really have a lot of time to think. You can't really stop time and think about what direction the story may go based on what decisions you choose, because the game is constantly pressuring you to make quick decisions. This not only gives players a sense of urgency and paranoia when making these tough, fast-paced decisions, but structuring these horror sequences this way also gives players the idea that whatever choice they make will leave lasting consequences on the characters in the story. However, these sequences and tactics, while effective, are nothing more than what I like to label as, quote, controlled chaos. Now, for the sake of this video, I'm defining controlled chaos as a scene or sequence in a game in which the tone and presentation seems so incredibly chaotic that it forces the player to make quick decisions and leave them with a sense of paranoia over whether they made the right decision. But in reality, the chaos was just a ruse to trick you into getting engaged with these moments. These scenes will end the same way regardless of what choice or decision you made. That's the point of, quote, controlled chaos. For example, let's take a look at this scene in Chapter 3, where Mike and Jess run away from what they believe to be a bear, though in actuality is the Wendigo. Now, if you're like any average gamer, your first instinct during this sequence would probably to do all the QuickTime events, and that makes sense. You have no idea what's chasing you, and you know that whatever mistake you make will lead to one of the characters' death. So it causes the player to have this sense of adrenaline and pressure to succeed at each of the QuickTime events in the hopes of avoiding danger. But what if you weren't the average gamer? What if instead, I don't know, you chose to make a meme out of the game and just refused to do any of the QuickTime events or make any decision whatsoever just to see what would happen to Mike and Jess, like what I did during my first playthrough? Well, let's take a look and see.
Oh my god, what the hell was that?
I don't know!
Oh, there's a break! Over here, over! Mike!
Oh, fuck! Shit!
Get over here!
It's a bear! It's gotta be a bear!
Oh, look! doing?
I don't know!
Mike, what are you doing?
I don't know!
Come on!
I don't know!
As you can see, if the player had chosen not to do anything, nothing major about that sequence would have changed whatsoever. Sure, some of the dialogue is different, and yes, there were some bits of new animation, but as you just saw earlier, even if you chose not to do any of the QuickTime events, the game still forces the characters to advance and reach the cabin. It really puts into perspective the idea that, quote, your choices have consequences, because if my choices had actually mattered, then me failing to do the QuickTime events would have punished me in some way, like having one of the characters die. But that doesn't happen. Instead, the game simply continues the plot as if I had completed the QuickTime events. This is one of many instances in Until Dawn in which by breaking the immersion of the game, I can break the illusion of free will that Until Dawn sets up. And while I'm not going to go in depth into any more examples because I think you guys get the point, it nonetheless showcases that the game isn't as free as it appears to be. If the game truly had such a sprawling, branching narrative, then I should feel like every decision I make, as well as any decision I don't make, should have lasting consequence on the story and characters. But there are only a few moments in the game where this sense of consequence actually occurs. If I truly had as much free will as the game said I did, then realistically, I would be allowed to play however I want. Yet it seems that the game is actively discouraging me from playing in a jokey, memey, immersion-breaking way until the end where it just kind of gives up and allows me to kill off every single character. Speaking of which, for a game that says that my choices will have lasting consequences on the characters, Mike and Sam are the two characters that Until Dawn prevents me from killing off until the last chapter of the game, a feature that not only makes my choices with these characters so much less important, but also betrays the idea of free will that the game markets itself for having. Additionally, the game will constantly remind you that your choices matter by indicating specifically through a message that your choice has caused a, quote, butterfly effect. The game presents the butterfly effect as something so important that it dedicates an entire page in the pause menu of all the, quote, different decisions you could have made. While this may look like you have a lot of options, in actuality, these differences are so minute and inconsequential that they don't really affect the plot in any major way. For example, one butterfly effect showcases the different ways Mike and Matt could interact with each other if Matt sees Mike hugging Emily. But in the end, you don't really care about this because it doesn't impact or change the story in any way, or even change the characters' fates. Speaking of false advertising features, totems are another aspect of the game that are featured. They serve as these special items that allow the player to see into the future and provide little hints as to what will happen to the characters at some point. And while this may seem useful and important, they serve as another tool that Supermassive Games uses in deceiving the players that they have actual choice and free will. You could go through the entire game without finding a single totem and still probably get the most positive outcome. And in my opinion, that just makes these totems feel really unimportant. However, in spite of everything I've said, I'm honestly not mad, or even disappointed. If anything, I'm impressed by Supermassive Games' deception and illusionary tactics, because despite knowing that nothing I did really mattered that much, I was still invested in the horror sequences. I was still compelled to click the right button during some of the QuickTime events because even though I personally didn't care about a single character in this entire game, I still felt that adrenaline rush that the game cleverly injected into me, and based on this game's critical reception, it appears that I'm not alone. I am aware that I am not the first person to point out the illusion of choice and free will in Until Dawn, and I most likely won't be the last. But I feel like despite players being well aware of how restrictive the game is, they don't really seem to mind. If anything, based on the game's reception, I actually believe that players really enjoy how the game isn't as free or open as they believe to be. I mean, I'm sure the players appreciated how they got to control what each character says and does, as well as allowing them to determine who lives and dies, but again, this all comes back to controlled chaos, the carefully meticulous but secretly restrictive horror sequences that give players that adrenaline and rush they need to make them feel like the choices they make are life and death decisions for the characters, even if they don't really mean that much in the end. Ultimately, despite Until Dawn not being as free or open as it was marketed as, I do believe that the game was effective in terms of what it wants to accomplish, and for the most part, players didn't really seem to mind that the butterfly system wasn't as consequential or complex as they thought it was. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that Until Dawn is not an isolated case. If you look at any game that claims to use similar buzzwords that I used at the beginning, like choices matter, impact story and characters, freedom of choice, do whatever you want, they utilize the same tactics that Until Dawn uses: controlled chaos and the illusion of free will and choice. A wide variety of games, ranging from similar point-and-click adventures like a Telltale or David Cage game, or open-world sandbox games like Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, or Grand Theft Auto 5. This is where my final and arguably most important argument comes in. If there's one thing to take away from my Until Dawn analysis, it's this. Not only is there no such thing as choice and freedom in a video game, but even if such ideas were possible and existed, players would reject them, because they take comfort in the amount of control and restrictiveness developers have put into a game. If you don't believe me, then you can look at every single critically well-received video game that has featured traits and aspects similar to Until Dawn. The first season of Telltale's The Walking Dead has a structure very similar to that of Until Dawn. The Walking Dead tricks you into thinking that your choices matter through multiple dialogue options, like Until Dawn, but regardless of what you choose, major events still play out the same way. Lily's father still loses a head. Kenny's wife and son still die. The St. Johns still die in gruesome ways, and Lee Everett still dies. But players don't really care because they're so invested with the game's story and the characters that they don't really stop and think about how little of options Telltale really provides. Red Dead Redemption 2 is considered by many to be one of the greatest video games of all time, and sure, the game has a massive open world that allows players to go wherever they want and play however they want, but this open world sandbox only makes up half of the game, with the other half being incredibly linear and structured missions that force players to play in the way Rockstar wants you to play. Yet despite this restriction, players don't really seem to care because they love the character of Arthur Morgan. They sympathize with his struggles to be a good man, and they cry when Arthur sacrifices himself near the end of the game. Even something as open and free as Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, considered by many to be one of the most free open-world sandbox games ever, still has certain restrictions you can't avoid. Sure, the game allows the players to go out and tackle any mission in any order, in any method that they choose, but there's still a beginning and an ending that's already determined that they have to go through. Seriously, you could go through any critically acclaimed video game released within the past, 2 or 3 decades, and they use very similar tactics and illusions to accomplish their goals the same way Until Dawn has. However, as I mentioned before, I'm not mad, disappointed, or even shocked by how little of control we as players actually have in video games. If anything, talking about what Until Dawn did and how that relates to other video games brings up a lot of interesting questions that I certainly would not only like to explore, but I'd also like to hear from you. Are video games inherently just control fantasies? Is it possible for free will and unlimited choice to exist in a video game? If not, then could such a concept be possible in the near future? Would we as players even want such unlimited choice and freedom in a video game in the first place? I know it seems strange to jump to these questions and conclusions based on what I've said about a dumb horror slasher game, but if that dumb horror slasher game manages to ask us questions like I mentioned before, then imagine the kinds of questions other games could ask. In the end, I don't really have any answers to these questions, but maybe you do.